So, welcome everyone to Researcher's Desk. It's a real pleasure today to welcome Fredrik von Malmborg, Associate Professor at Linköping University. Fredrik's going to talk with us today about strategies and impacts of policy entrepreneurs, ideology, democracy, and the quest for a just transition. Fredrik, it's a real pleasure having you with us. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with our community. And I'm going to hand over the floor to you. I'm going to turn my own camera off once we've got things set up. But I will be in the background, and if there's any technical issues, I'll just pop up out of nowhere. Warm welcome,
Yeah.
Fredrik.
Okay. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Just before I start with the presentation, should mention something of the background. I've been working for quite a long time with the government offices in Sweden, doing practical work, negotiating several pieces of EU legislation on energy and climate policy. And after some years, I thought perhaps I should go back to academia, seeing if I can do something of my experiences and digging deeper into the issue of policy processes in EU climate policy politics. And I have been doing this for about 3-4 years now, applying a lot of different theoretical frameworks to understand policy frameworks, policy processes, different political science frameworks, where one of them, or I should say, a concept that is used in several of the frameworks is the concept of policy entrepreneur. And in my studies focusing on the processes, I also looked more deeply into the role and agency of policy entrepreneurs, and kind of experienced that some of them are perhaps doing good things kind of in the name of climate policy, but they are sometimes violating democratic norms. So I was interested in going deeper into this area and see if there is anything else or anything done previously and so on. So that's some of the backgrounds. And I should say am doing research now on climate policy processes in the EU and in Sweden. And on this specific presentation, I will provide some insights and results both from the EU level and from Swedish climate politics. And could say the title of the presentation is actually also the title of the paper that I published in the beginning of the summer. It's kind of a mix of a review paper and kind of an original research paper, providing or reviewing a lot of literatures on policy entrepreneurs, democracy, climate governance, and also looking into specific issues of policy entrepreneurship in climate policy. But now as you see how we'll go to the next slide here. I should also say that policy entrepreneurship is somewhat related to, or policy entrepreneurism is somewhat related to lobbyism, with some differences that policy entrepreneurs can be a lot of other actors than you normally consider as lobbyists can act as policy entrepreneurs. But they are, like lobbyists, they are working on kind of trying to influence public policy processes in substance and in the process. And over the years in the EU, there has been, or I should say, where there is some or the first stage of regulating lobbyism, there is a need for organizations doing advocacy towards the EU institution, a need to register in the EU Transparency Register. And the number of organizations has increased. And some of the reasons for the increased advocacy is the close European integration, spreading of digital technologies, and so on. Personalization of politics, more complex and multi-level, multi-dimensional political issues. As for policy entrepreneurs, they are kind of defined as advocates willing to invest resources to promote a position, usually kind of their own position, compared to some of the lobbyists which are promoting someone else's position. But in return for anticipated gains, material purposes, solidary benefits, money, or something else. But they attempt to transform policy ideas into policy innovations, aim to influence agenda setting and the beliefs and policy preferences of other policy actors in the policy processes. They are usually also considered trying to differentiate a policy entrepreneur from an ordinary policy actor doing advocacy. They are considered to take an above average, or they have an above average willingness to take risks, or they, like some research I've mentioned, they punch above their weight. They have also been seen as heroic or crazies, trying to change the world. They have been found, I should say, initially they were only thought to be individuals, but as for many other concepts in social science or in political science, kind of the initial meaning of the concept has evolved. And initially it was the concept of policy entrepreneur was included in a kind of a more overall framework of understanding policy processes called the multiple streams framework. But it has become kind of a topic of itself to analyze policy entrepreneurs with no specific link to a more general or larger framework for analyzing policy processes. So policy entrepreneurs are referred to also in other theoretical frameworks like the advocacy coalition framework and other ones. But there is now, from the initial view, it's only about individuals. Now most research considers also organizations to be policy entrepreneurs, although there is usually an individual or a group of individuals within an organization that are kind of driving an issue. And they are found in the private sector, in business associations, but also in the public sector, in national authorities or local governments, in political parties, in academia, in civil society organizations. And just to place what's the role of the policy entrepreneur in the policy process, this is kind of my picture of the multiple streams framework, where you have kind of a problem stream, a policy stream, and a politics stream, which are to be merged. The problem stream defines or frames the problem. You will kind of try to identify or come up with a solution to the problem in the policy stream. Sometimes you have an idea of a policy and look for a problem instead. But this linking of the different streams is done by policy entrepreneurs, and they are usually developing or framing the problems and framing the policies. And the framing is, or the coupling is done when the policy window is opened, which makes, to some extent, the politics stream attentive to problems and policies. And in the review I did for the contemporary research, I found that most, or actually all research is analytical, focusing on the strategies employed, the reasons for success, the motives of policy entrepreneurs and so on. But there is a fluid definition of policy entrepreneurs, and there is also the context in which they work is often overlooked. More, I shouldn't say problematic, but interesting is that the researchers, the academics, assume that policy entrepreneurship is a political fact, that it takes place anyway. Whatever we think about policy entrepreneurship, how it is related to democracy, democratic processes, and so on. And many leading scholars are stressing the need for more actors to become policy entrepreneurs, and they try to come up with handbooks on how would a policy entrepreneur work to pursue their views on policies. And in relation to climate change, the research is also kind of focusing on the positive role of policy entrepreneurs for guiding advocacy practices and developing new policies for climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. Summarizing kind of the current model, the focus is very much on trying to find the link between the actor, the policy entrepreneur coming from different sectors, with the impacts. And the main focus is on how do they impact agenda setting, how do they impact others' beliefs and policy preferences, how do they impact the policy outcome, and to some extent the structure of democratic institutions if you see there is a need to change the democratic institutions to better govern climate change. And what links the actor to the impacts and the outcome is the strategies, the aims, and the actions. But what I saw is that, and also looking into the more extensive research on lobbyism, is that several key activities of policy entrepreneurs, like problem framing, policy formulation, and so on, are always political, and many of the political decisions are taken by policy entrepreneurs and not by the formal decision makers, which gives kind of an impression of an elitist or technocratic approach with non-transparency in policy making. I saw also there is some of the most important strategies of policy entrepreneurs in pursuing their positions is to manipulate people, manipulate decision makers. So kind of a initial thought of mine is that just like there is a discussion of how to regulate or how to call on lobbyists and experts to generate legitimacy and accountability, you should put the same requirements on policy entrepreneurs and start look into what impact do policy entrepreneurs have on democracy and democratic policy processes. I'm not sure if it can go as far as to say, are they good or bad for democracy, because that depends on what view you have on democracy. And turning then into climate change, and particularly kind of the discussions both in academia and in public policy about a just transition, you introduce a lot of new topics. The human rights issue is much more is highlighted much more. You have justice, equity, equality, inclusion, who are included in the policy processes, and there is generally a view in democracy literature on justice as both a procedural justice about who is able to participate in the policy process, and there is the distributive justice on how our costs and benefits distributed between citizens geographically, temporally, and so on. This all leads to kind of discussion of what are the guiding principles for climate policy. For a long time, well, cost efficiency has been the guiding principle, but increasingly legitimacy, accountability, and justice are also important. And for the first time ever, the current government in Sweden introduced legitimacy, sort of, I should say, in the climate action plan. They refer to popular legitimacy, or folklig legitimitet in Sweden, which I know some of my colleagues in political science in Sweden thought, well, this is interesting. They're including legitimacy for the first time. And that's an issue that has been raised by the Swedish Climate Policy Council for a while. I thought rather that they don't include legitimacy, they included popular legitimacy, knowing that Sweden Populist Party, I kind of suspected that this is something fishy, which made me want to look a bit more into it. I can skip this. There's kind of different theories, different views with different ideologies on the environment, democracy nexus, drawing on different political theories about democracy. But looking at the links between policy entrepreneurs, the advocacy, and the democracy, to find out, is this good or bad? What are the important democratic norms to look into? There is first the question of public interest. How do you define public interest? What is part of public interest in different theories of democracy? You have kind of the aggregative liberal view on democracy, and the procedural deliberative perspective on democracy, which is kind of adhered to by a lot of the climate movements, the environmental movements. In Sweden, you also have an interesting for analyzing kind of our policy entrepreneurs good or bad. So also the substantive or the populist view on public interest. But generally, the aggregative is the or the public interest is kind of defined by kind of the competition of different views, and then through elections, you will find out what is in the public interest. The procedural looks more into the process itself, not so much the substance, and the substantive is focusing very much on one kind of is an anti-pluralistic ideology, looking at one truth or the ultimate goal, and usually that is defined not by the public or the popular, but by the populist, saying that they are kind of representing the public, but usually they are, according to all the democracy literature on populism, that it's the populist movement, the populist parties that defines what is the public interest and don't really listen to anyone else. But from this, you can also find different norms of democracy, which are important to look into if you're going to analyze how policy entrepreneurs are impacting democracy, like accountability and its relation to transparency, openness, fairness, legitimacy, and justice. These are linked. I've used kind of legitimacy and accountability as the two overall norms, where accountability is actually also feeding into legitimacy, and the other ones are feeding into the different norms. But then from the empirical findings, I looked into different cases of EU policy process in the Fit for 55 package. I could find quite a lot of non-transparency, both from the European Commission as a policy entrepreneur, and they are in several cases or in different areas of different policy areas like finance, social issues, a lot of different policy areas they are, or policy domains, they have been considered policy entrepreneurs. But I found also non-transparency among other policy entrepreneurs from private sector, from civil society. It's hard to really understand who did really propose something and on what grounds. And from the European Commission perspective, which has the formal right to propose legislation, there is general discrimination in relation to kind of the process on when they prepare a legal proposal. They don't include everyone in the stakeholder consultation. There is also what you can specifically in legal or law studies refer to as a competence creep. The European Commission is trying to expand its powers into areas where it has no powers according to the treaty. So it kind of disguises social policy or housing policy as energy policy, and try to kind of provide legislation into social policy and housing policy through energy legislation or climate legislation. For justice, it can be, it's quite obvious, specifically from my research on decarbonization of shipping, where the Commission identified that those affected the most are companies and other actors outside of the EU, but they were not included in the processes. And neither do they have a possibility to get compensation through the kind of just transition mechanism or social climate fund or the financial transactions, which is the main focus of climate justice in the EU. In Sweden, looking at the Tidö government, there was a lot of manipulation of information. I think most of you know of this. The Climate Policy Council claiming that the entire climate action plan was factually flawed. They redefined a lot of democratic concepts like the popular legitimacy, and they claim the policies are referring to climate justice, but in a very strange way. There is a non-transparency, there is a huge discrimination of which actors can or were and are included in the policy processes. You also have the smearing and the delegitimization of opponents, widespread use of what is called nasty rhetoric with hate and threats, repression of opponents, getting people fired for being climate activists, changes in the judicial system, getting climate activists sentenced to prison, a lot of censoring, unwillingness to make interviews with journalists, for instance. So, in conclusion, I found a lot of democratic deficits from most of the policy entrepreneurs, but most specifically from the European Commission and the government as policy entrepreneurs, and both from liberal and deliberative perspectives on democracy, which is partly related to kind of the neo-corporatist, neoliberal systems in Sweden and the EU, where there's been a long-term reliance on industry or kind of the relation between industry and the state, and not including social or civil society organizations. This is also related to the discourse on ecological modernization, focusing on technology and not the social change and social justice. In Sweden, this can be seen as also part of the autocratization of Swedish far-right populists, the cultural war on climate politics, and a technocratization in the EU, which in all leads me to conclude that not only the strategies used by policy entrepreneurs affect the outcomes of what they are doing, but also the importance of context and on the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level, but the motives of actors which are also related to ideology, that ideology is important, kind of ideology to the policy entrepreneur adhere to. So kind of developing the model, revising the model First of all, that you have to look at different outcomes, different impacts of policy entrepreneurs, not only the policy output, but the relationship to democratic norms. And that context is indeed not that it may influence the strategies and the agency of policy entrepreneurs, but it actually and indeed does. And that ideology, whether it is democracy or liberal or deliberative democracy, technocracy, autocracy, or so, will have an impact. So, and I have most of this is summarized in the first paper in this list, but I also have a lot of other papers published or in press on policy entrepreneurs. So thanks. That was the introduction.
And thank you very much, Fredrik, for a really instructive and pedagogic talk. We've learned a lot today. I really appreciate you being with us here at